Hello and welcome to the 7th annual SF Urban Film Fest. Thank you to everyone for joining us for what is afternoon in San Francisco anyway, for our program, Pandemic of Opportunity, How to Change the Public Realm. My name is Robin Abada-Cabillo, and I'm one of the curators for this program today. I also want to acknowledge the rest of our SF Urban Film Festival team, our founder and executive producer, Faye Darmawi, curator Susie Smith, our humanities advisor, Professor Ron Sundstrom, our program manager, Christelle, Chelek, our social media manager, Hannah Moore, and now I'll also introduce my co-curator for this program, Omid Manocheri.
Hi, Robin. Hello to our audience all over the world. Hi. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. As Robin said, my name is Omid Manocheri. I'm a program producer with the SF Urban Film Fest. And this festival is a venture that's very close to my heart and where I've called my creative and intellectual home for the last 5 years. So I'm so happy to have you all with us here today. To start off, we'd like to offer a land acknowledgement gifted to us from the American Indian Cultural District. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their tradition, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. We are presenting this land acknowledgement to promote visibility for the Ramaytush Ohlone and all American Indians living and thriving today on their ancestral homelands. A few quick announcements, everyone. We're all getting used to navigating virtual events, so unpredictable things can happen, and we thank you for your patience and bearing with us. If you have any issues, please leave a message in the comment box below on our website or in the Facebook and YouTube chat. We also want to encourage you to make use of that chat functionality to have your questions answered and your comments heard, and to let us know that you're there. We miss seeing your faces. And finally, I want to alert everyone that this session is being recorded. So if you have to step away or something comes up or you want to share it with your friends, thank you for that. Back to Robin and on with our program.
Thank you, Omid. So we'll spend about the next 30 or so minutes in conversation with our panelists, whom I'll introduce shortly, and then another 10 or so minutes to do Q&A with you all. So as Omid said, please send us questions if the films provoke some thoughts in you, or you would like the panelists to address something. Use those comment functions to get those questions over to us. I'd also like to thank the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts here in San Francisco, where the SF Urban Film Festival is an artist in residence. Today's program about public realm is accompanied by an installation at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts curated by Susie Smith on the external walls and windows of the YBCA. And so that exhibit investigating mourning, loss, will be in place until mid-March. So you have until mid-March to go and check that out, and we encourage you to do that. Some other films also produced by The New Yorker and reflecting on these themes of sort of mourning and grieving are on display and being projected on the walls and in the windows of the YBCA. Also want to thank our co-presenters for this afternoon's program, the Project for Public Spaces in New York and the American Institute of Architects San Francisco chapter. And to all of our members, San Francisco Urban Film Festival is a huge family building exercise, and we're so grateful for everyone, not only for tuning in, but also becoming members. If you'd like to do that, please visit our website. We are an entirely volunteer-run organization, and so your participation and support and donations are really welcome. It helps us bring these programs to the public. So with that, All of our housekeeping out of the way, let's get into some discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, Vivian Dumpa, who's tuning in from Athens, Greece. She's an associate partner with Stipo, who is based in the Netherlands. Hi, Vivian. Welcome. Next, we have Jung-In Kim, professor of architecture at Seoul University in Seoul, Korea. Hello, Jung-In. And last but not least, Dr. Juliet Kane with the Project for Public Spaces in New York, who is the director of programs there. Hi, Juliet.
Hi, Robin. Thanks for having me.
Hi. Thank you to PPS also for co-presenting this afternoon's presentation. Well, it's afternoon for us here in San Francisco. It's, I think, very early morning in Korea, afternoon in New York, and very late in the evening in Athens. So I want to start out actually by asking Juliet a question about some thoughts that the films provoked in me, but also just looking to the future about how we as public space advocates and activists and technocrats and bureaucrats, academicians and scholars can help sort of propel us to a new and different future. One of the things that was so struck me about these films is that they were made almost a year ago, and they're actually quite somber. They really document a kind of specific moment in the pandemic this last year, and I think a real specific feeling too of kind of desolation and isolation. But we all know, everyone who's here today and many folks who are tuning in, that cities have really addressed themselves to this problem, in particular how public space can be used as an asset and as a tool for helping us stay connected, for helping us survive socially and psychologically through this kind of extended trauma that we're all going through. So Juliet, your role at the Project for Public Spaces is about bringing together around events and programs, a lot of that about public space, a lot of that in public space. And you've also experienced that as a New Yorker, sort of, living in one of the densest cities in the world that has a particular kind of thriving culture of public space. So just wondering if you could reflect for us about kind of what you see New York going through and how you've seen it pushing and changing the way the public realm can service this need we have to be connected.
Thanks, Robin. And those are great points and great questions that you ask. I appreciate these films that were chosen. They all spoke to me, particularly because I'm in New York, and one was about that, but also New Orleans. We held an event there in 2018, and New Orleans being kind of featuring some of the best street life in the US, being able to see how they were moving throughout public space during that time of lockdown was really, really important to see. But yeah, to answer your question, I think you brought up an important word, which was trauma. And I think that that's something all cities are experiencing, well, beyond cities, but since we're here talking about that in some way, shape, or form, and are still dealing with it. So even though the films were somber, I think it still highlights and reminds us of what we've all been through, what cities have been through and are going to continue to have to grapple with for a long time. And New York in particular is no stranger to trauma. So in the film that we saw, you definitely see a desolate, quiet, empty New York that looks very different than what we're all used to. And I think it definitely was a shock to the residents that are here for obvious reasons. And New York, people and businesses here were already on the brink. There were problems that existed far before this pandemic that were a concern for cities like New York. And this just pushed it over the edge. I think after New York's lockdown started to ease and coming, I don't want to say coming out, but leaving the kind of darkest moment that I think we've had here, businesses shutting down and streets emptying, and spring sort of came into effect, and you started to see a change. And I think what it highlighted to me was public space when this happened was really kind of feared. It was oh no, why would you want to be out in public and around people? And I think there was a sense in our world that for a while, well, what's going to happen? Is it public space dead? Do we have to rethink all of this? And what we saw a few months later, and particularly here in New York, I think was this, awakening of, wait, public space might save us. It's potentially the answer to so many of our problems. And what's to me important about that is a lot of what we saw here in New York and other cities is a lot of it was citizen led. So you had the inhabitants of the city coming together or on their own with their families, making their porches places to be, making their streets places to be, and just going for it. So, I'm sure anyone watching has seen images of New York becoming these, the space for more walking and more biking and playing and finding ways to meet with people, get to know their neighbors in ways that they didn't, because, now you're kind of only stuck with people that you have around you. So I really think citizen-led was something I really saw, and also this change from public space being feared to being a place that now we're using in so many ways to really get us through this. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Could you talk a little bit more about citizen-led? Because I know, certainly for my practice, here in San Francisco as an urban designer, and for everyone who's on the panel today, we are really focused on how to make public space not only design, but stewardship, governance around public space more equitable, democratic, and just seeking, wider and more genuine participation from community and local communities. So when you talk about citizen-led in terms of what you've seen in New York and what PPS has sort of witnessed or indexed, in the kind of the national work that you do, the conferences that you hold, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for me, what's highlighted there and something we are always learning about at Project for Public Spaces is kind of what's working for people. How can people take action and watch it succeed? And in the conferences that we hold, what I particularly love about them is that we're able to see all around the US, abroad, what people are actually seeing as their success stories. And I think the key to that is that we find when things are citizen-led, they tend to stick because things are actually designed for the communities that use these public spaces and have a say in what happens to their communities. And as a result, there's a lot more success in what ends up being the result. So citizen-led during the pandemic, I think, there was probably a little bit less being regulated. Maybe people were a little more inspired and just did what we call a lighter, quicker, cheaper approach of let's just do it and deal with all the problems afterwards and get in trouble later for putting, this paint on the street or this bench in the wrong place. And I think that as we all know, as urbanists, that's really what brings a city alive, are those kind of activations and implementations. And they're quick and they happen spontaneously. And I think that's really what I'm gathering from this concept of citizen-led. It just has so much more meaning, but obviously it's complicated, and the word regulations and everything else causes problems for all of us, which I'm sure we can get into. But what I have seen is that kind of action was able to take place quite rapidly in so many places, and it's just very inspiring to see.
Yeah, and I think that citizen-led activity or more grassroots kind of leadership can thrive if the kind of the policy environment, the regulatory environment, it does become more flexible and open, right? And I think that is certainly a lot of experimentation we're seeing here in the Bay Area in California, but cities around the country recognizing that this extreme time of crisis requires us to meet the moment with flexibility and innovation. And sometimes the way the rubber hits the road is to ease customary regulations and to, ease bureaucratic processes to allow a little bit more room and flexibility for experimentation to flourish. So, you know, I think that's a key precondition for, you know, grassroots efforts to, you know, sort of succeed in the first place, but then also the impacts that people intend to sustain. So, you know, I'm also curious, thinking now to Vivian, who I forget if I mentioned earlier that Vivian's also a founding member and on the board of Placemaking Europe. You know, thinking about trends and patterns across regions, you know, or areas of the world like Europe. Are there any patterns that you're detecting and seeing from your work with Stipo and Placemaking X in terms of ways that European cities are responding? Are there any commonalities, and in what way are there differences? I mean, Athens is a very different place culturally and socially from Berlin, or, you know, Valencia from, you know, Amsterdam. And so there are a lot of great sort of universal maybe tools and lessons, but then there are also ways that different places have to respond given the context that they have.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Thank you very much, Robin, for offering me this opportunity to share from our learnings here in Europe. A pattern that we have seen is this tendency for experimentation, as you have already mentioned. So what we have seen is that cities have loosened up a little bit the framing around bureaucracy and how they deal with public space and the management of public space. So they have started to try out things more like the lighter, quicker, cheaper, or tactical urbanism, mostly related to, if I may say, mobility measures. This is something that we have seen that a lot around Greece, at least, in the two big cities of Thessaloniki and Athens. Something that has also been a pattern of discussion, fortunately, is this citizen-led initiatives, and to what extent the social capital is now put towards the forward of the whole discussion. So how do you build social capital through placemaking, through offering more public space to the people? And of course, it draws the whole discussion around accessibility of public space. In many cities that have, you know, you have the city center, but you have also the periphery around the urban center that you might not have so much access to public space. This is something that was extremely highlighted. And this is something that was very prominent here in the main city of Greece, in Athens. We have had measures around the city center, but many of the neighborhoods around were left without any opportunity to have access to public space. However, most of Europeans realized the need for public space, the need for common spaces as well, and we realized other kind of formats of space that we could use outside our own homes. We realized the value of our balconies, those kind of hybrid spaces that you might find between the private and the public, like small street corners, the stoep, as we call it in the Netherlands, so the first part of your building, or maybe the stairs of your building as a common space where you can meet with friends and have the sense of comfort that you might find in, that we used to find it in other places, but you can now find it in these hybrid locations. And maybe the last point, if I may say, is something that, especially now during the second and the third phase of lockdowns that we are currently in, is the role of culture and how much we're missing it, and how culture can relate to public space and how we can actually use culture at the moment more than ever to bring us closer to each other, even though we cannot be in social proximity with each other. So, thank you.
Yes, absolutely, definitely. You know, at least in the kind of Western, you might say, Eurocentric tradition, you know, public space, the outdoors, the, you know, are commonly shared places are where that culture is enacted, and where we you know, participate, and we have rituals of connectedness. And I mean, I'm thinking in San Francisco, you know, if there's not a pandemic lockdown, we'll have a street fair or a protest or a celebration or a demonstration for almost any reason, and there has been so much in the last year, especially, I think, pent up in terms of our desire and our longing to be with one another and find community around, around many different issues, and find solidarity around that. And that's really curtailed with all of the safety and health protocols that are in place around gathering. And so, but there is also this really beautiful, I feel like, certainly what we're seeing here across cities on the West Coast of the United States, finding ways to create these third places and these outdoor spaces of socialization, these other third places in a more quotidian, everyday way. So something as simple as allowing for outdoor dining to take place outdoors, and to ease the customary regulations we had on letting restaurants, deliver food services outside. I mean, so something so simple as eating outside is, you could say, very quintessentially European, but not something that had quite, thrived here in San Francisco for a number of different reasons. Some of them being the way that we kind of have regulated those spaces. So there's been some experimentation around that creates in my view, a whole new civic experience for San Franciscans. It's unfortunate it took a pandemic to kind of push us into this kind of innovation. Nonetheless, I think we're seeing an embrace of these experiments, and there are new expectations about them being a more permanent or lasting part of our experiences as city dwellers. So, well, sort of on the subject of our kind of, expectations about public space being very much based in our own cultural background or our cultural settings, I would like to sort of turn it over to Jung-in, who is a scholar and a practicing architect that splits time between the West Coast of the United States and Seoul, Korea, and studying East Asian cities. These are really different cultural traditions, right? The conception of what is public, what is shared, what things are enacted out in shared space versus, in maybe more private or enclosed indoor spaces, that varies very differently between the East and West, to generalize. But even within Asia, the culture of the public realm varies widely depending on where on the continent you are. So I wondered, Jung-in, if you could, offer some reflections on, specifically, in Seoul and, sort of the context of Korean culture, what the impacts of COVID have been for socializing, being together, maybe implications for public space or the way that public space is now regarded, given what COVID has done to kind of the social life of your city and other Asian cities, for that matter.
Thanks, Robin. Well, I split my time half in Seoul and half in Bay Area. So the way you framed it in the kind of cultural condition and the public space, I just wonder, when we say the quote unquote the public might be the conditioned term, so-called culturally conditioned terms, perhaps, because the public space is perhaps historically formed in a way. Then if we look at that sense, then in East Asia, like the city like Seoul, do we have really public space in that sense? The emphasis of the plaza, which is piazza, we don't, in the before 20th century, the city doesn't have. The emphasis of the street also, is a very questionable in that sense. But of course, there is a kind of the people sharing commonality and so-called public condition, of course, exists. But how do we frame it? And in my opinion, it's always changing in a sense. It's very dynamic, So the people invent, in a sense, public condition. So when in the film, in that sense, is inspiring. The way it framed the city is, the city is extremely dense, but the film doesn't show that dense condition, but rather shows more wide open space and very signature architecture, monumental space, and some remnant of the old historic district. So in this sense, I mean, the people are innovative and inventing it somehow. So I've been observed, the public condition is normally happen interior of a space, so-called interior of buildings. I mean, unlike European condition, Eurocentric condition, there's not much of the kind of street cafeteria and going outside, and that condition doesn't really observed, but rather people gather, doing their own innovative stuff, like, Korean style of karaoke, we call it the norebang, and then the bathhouse called the jjimjilbang, and all this condition is kind of the, in traditional definition is the private and public is a blur. The line is blurred. So, one of a good way to paraphrasing this public the innovation is, the drive-through test condition that, in the Korean media is so proud of it. They invented it in the public space, and then this is not really automobile-oriented society, but they try to, engage with a new condition, the changing condition, and how do we deal with this? In that sense, our notion of public is still, changing, and try to engage new innovation, perhaps.
So in a cultural condition where most socializing takes place indoors and not necessarily in the piazza or in the parklet, what has that meant for people living in Seoul? I mean, to me, and I'm making an assumption that this makes it all the harder to kind of keep your sanity and your optimism, right, about your future if there's not a traditional culture of meeting your friends outside, or public spaces being designed and conceived to really hold this kind of activity. What has it meant for folks in Seoul? And is there a government response? Is there a policy response? Is there, within the design community, is there a response to the fact that socializing can no longer happen indoors, but it has to happen somewhere? I'm so curious.
Yeah, it's more devastating in a sense, because under pandemic, the state doesn't allow to gather inside it's more stricter limitation in that sense. But I think people are innovative in other way. So I see now perhaps the city, people in Seoul begin to think about what do we do with those larger open space, right? So the city is extremely dense, but it doesn't look very dense in the film because it's a very modernist city. So most of people live in the collective housing, we call the apartments. So under pandemic, it created a lot of problems. There's a noise condition, it's a difficult condition. So I'm not for sure tell that there is the answer for it, but it seems like people here begin to think about it. What do we do with this? The architecture and urban space, a sort of imported condition, right? It's a very much European or American idea, which is applied to the Asian cities. But people here, now the results are here, and then, the innovation is also one area of adapting oneself to it. So how do we deal with this kind of new conditions with a given space? So that might be an interesting phenomena unfold in future.
Yeah. It sounds like maybe a placemaking East Asia opportunity to, explore how these big monumental spaces, which weren't really conceived to host public life in a sense, at least not within the in a cultural context that was, appropriate or specific to where they were applied. How can those be retrofitted? It's an interesting question, and who takes ownership of that, and who leads experimentation. Because it is the place. It's the place to socialize safely, is outside. Well, we're also getting some really great questions from all over. I see some questions coming in from Oakland, the UK, Michigan. And so maybe we'll start to pose some of these to our panelists. One is, well, this is a very straightforward and simple one. What are some of the most exciting new examples, specific examples that you've seen of healthy outdoor placemaking? And let's think COVID responsive outdoor placemaking to make it more specific. So, and I'll start off to give folks time to rack their brains about what you're seeing in your respective regions. But I mentioned earlier that in San Francisco, we launched a large experiment to move commercial activity outdoors. So this is a program called Shared Spaces, and it has been leveraged mostly by restaurants, serving patrons outdoors because clearly we can't do it inside. And some by retailers and other neighborhood small businesses. And so we largely leverage the parklet typology that San Francisco has been, it has incubated for the last 10 years and is now part of our kind of vernacular, right? It's a very common kind of public space installation that you'd see in San Francisco anytime over the last 10 years. And we've taken that and adapted it to the demands of COVID, and have seen that really explode. We went from 60 parklets across San Francisco to almost 3,000 applications for similar occupancies out in the public realm. And I mentioned that because the significance to me is at that scale, really transforming the experience of your neighborhood, right? Transforming the experience of as a parent with a child, or just anyone walking through the city. It's a whole different condition San Franciscans are used to, and one that we're used to in Asia and Latin America and through Europe, certainly. So I'm really excited about that, and to see us continue not only helping small businesses to survive by giving them access to more space to keep their employees employed, and these entrepreneurs, realizing their dreams, but also the implications for civics and public life are really huge too. So that's the example that I'll offer to the group. But yeah, I'm curious in New York or in Europe, in Asia.
I can jump in, Robin.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of great questions coming in, so my mind's like rolling. But what comes to mind for that? Obviously, there's a lot here in New York, and piggybacking on what Robin said, we're obviously seeing a lot of that here, and it is really exciting because New York, being this kind of example of active street life, but seeing the change of turning that outdoors has really changed the street life in New York to another level, along with particularly during lockdown, when many streets were closed and more open for pedestrians, cyclists, and anything in between, was still, something we all know about, but I still am fascinated by it. One thing I wanted to highlight, though, that's been inspiring to me relates a little more to kind of creativity, art, and like the process of healing. Because obviously a lot of businesses closed in New York and other cities, and many of them have been boarded up, and it's just creates an overall very sad reality to what we're dealing with. And many artists have taken to the streets to kind of liven that up and use that as a canvas for expression, whether it's to bring joy to the neighborhood, and not make it feel so dark or sad, but similarly to use as a form of protest. So in New York here as well, just the fact that public space became a place not only for outdoor dining, but for people to come out and speak their minds about things they're frustrated about, or whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement protests that took place here. I think murals also became a really important part of that. And right now there's a lot of space available for New Yorkers to use that space as a canvas. So I've found that quite effective and interesting and inspiring to see.
I really love that. Yeah, last night we had a program focusing on the creation of murals as building spiritual infrastructure, and so we had some incredible artists and filmmakers talking and activists talking about sort of political activism in Oakland and connecting that to the way that artists are visualizing and running community process to try and to get people together to organize not only around public art projects, but around political and social issues in Oakland. And so this recalls a group here in San Francisco called Paint the Void, and we can put their link in the banner so that you all can check them out. These folks are helping to connect artists with grants for opportunities to paint boarded up storefronts, so that there's still some engagement, right, with the urban environment, some artistic creative connection that's happening even while these storefronts aren't able to operate because of COVID, they're shut down or what have you. So I really love Paint the Void, and think there's such an incredible example of how we're all showing up in response to this crisis, in particular about these issues of kind of public life and the public realm. So, but I don't know, Vivian or Jongin, any reflections? Like what's inspired you? What have you found to be really beautiful and compelling examples of placemaking in response to COVID?
Mm-hmm. Something very similar to what you have already mentioned is the extension of the balcony, especially here for the southern countries of Europe. And we have seen them being activated a lot, either through artworks that the families would create of supportive messages, then they would hang them on their balconies in order to send beautiful messages around the neighborhood and the neighbors for this kind of mental community support that you sometimes need. Or creating even more formal kind of programming on the balconies. In my hometown in Thessaloniki, one of our neighborhoods created a small music festival on the balconies throughout the streets. So one evening they all went out and performed music. Some other friends of mine in Izmir, they're hosting an arts festival in their balconies. But this is also a concept that it was even before the pandemic. I first met it in Bremen, actually in Germany. Some were not so southern, but they were also using their balconies there. And something that I found it also very inventive also from my own practice, since I put a lot of effort in the participation and inclusion around placemaking, is how we have tried to shift all the placemaking practice from the physical space to the virtual one. I think this is something that we have started to create a kind of community of practice, let's say, that we share a lot of knowledge around how to use this kind of means that we currently have in our hands in order to engage as more people, to empower people, so that when we are able to be out again, we will come out stronger and more connected than before.
Well, in the Asian cases, especially Seoul, I think rather than have a exemplar spaces. I rather want to comment on how this condition create a new demand, in a sense, because I noticed that the relationship between a state and the individuals, or kind of state and the public realm, is quite differently organized between this. I mean, I cannot generalize, but in here in Seoul and different cities in the West, especially American cities. So here it's more state dominated, in a way that, you know, there's always incredible coping organism from the state, like, you know, how to regulate, how to, you know, quarantine people, and how to do all this, you know, to prevent the spreading out of virus. In that sense, I mean, I see quite a difference there in people's response. But on the other hand, I think, you know, it generate a kind of new realization to the people. I mean, you know, in terms of space, here also there's a new demand that arises. You know, is this the condition that we live in, that, you know, like apartment housing, the collective living is appropriate in future? So I can see the new demand is coming out. Why don't you, you know, imagine different type of living spaces in a way that is different from the one we had? So in that regard, it's an interesting point, you know, how, you know, I mean, now the flow is kind of blocked. There's a limitation, you know, the traveling is very difficult. And then also the rising condition of, you know, who's insider, who's outsider, you know, that condition also is rising, which is you know, I mean, as a you know, to create a sound public space, we need to challenge all this, you know, the new condition that arises from this pandemic. So in that way, there's a new challenges, and also the new demand is rising also.
So there are, in a way, we've been focusing on kind of immediate short-term reactions or tactics to this new world that COVID has presented to us. But we also know that there will be long-term structural changes, you know, maybe to economy, to governance, certainly to the use of public space, to travel, to everything. And it's exciting to think about what it might mean for architectural practice, right? Like what kind of, and development, urban development, what kind of living spaces, whether that, you know, it's community housing or others, are we producing? How are they maybe produced to be more resilient and to help their residents be more resilient through these kinds of shocks, you know, extreme isolation or lockdown. You know, so that's really interesting to contemplate that longer term. Will city fabric look different? You know, our urban fabric and our built environment. We obviously have been going about it a certain way, and this is in the ways that other crises, like you know, the climate crisis, or you know, storms like Sandy and Katrina and others have forced us to maybe start thinking a little bit differently about our settlement and development patterns. This might impact the way we're thinking about the products of those development, especially in terms of where people are living. So we're a little bit over time, I think, but we're getting so many wonderful questions from our audience that I think we want to stay for a little bit longer. So why don't we do at least maybe 2 more questions from the audience, and then we can bring it to a close. So one really insightful and provocative question from Alexi in Oakland, you know, kind of gets at the title of this program, which is A Pandemic of Opportunity, How to Remake the Public Realm. But Alexi's question kind of reframes that And Juliet has kind of reframed this question as a pandemic of opportunity, but for whom? So we know that any crisis, whether that's a global pandemic or otherwise, any shared crisis deepens inequities that already existed, right? Whether those be economic or amplifications of racial injustice. Some communities are disproportionately impacted, negatively impacted by COVID. Certainly, if you look at infection rates and mortality rates, Black and brown communities are clearly bearing the brunt of those sad statistics. So, but to get back specifically to Alexi's question, a lot of what we're doing is about creating spaces for activities like shopping, dining, biking to transpire more easily, right? To retrofit our public realm, retrofit our regulatory environment to make these things happen with a little bit more flexibility and ease. But does this come at the expense of other people in our community, other folks in our cities who we also have to think about? And so I'll just leave that question open. Maybe Juliet, if you wanna start with your thoughts on Alexi's question.
Sure. Thanks, Robin. And yeah, I really appreciated Alexi's question, and it's the pandemic of opportunity for whom. So I think people who are interested, as we are in the urban realm and trying to make quote unquote improvements, are very excited about, what came out of learning that streets are better closed down because people can participate more in them and everything that comes with that. But a lot of the problems that we were dealing with before the pandemic are still here. And, the pandemic allowed us to see a lot of what's possible in public space and how people use it in creative ways and how it can benefit all communities in so many ways. But there's also the downside of over time, as we try to implement these things, some people will not benefit from those changes because how cities choose to prioritize certain neighborhoods over others is obviously one factor. I know when Open Streets here in New York took place, I am lucky enough to live alongside a green space. I'm already near a green space, and a street right next to where I am was closed down for traffic. Obviously, I appreciated that, but there were definitely plenty of other areas or streets that might not have access to a green space that could have been closed down. And obviously, those are complicated decisions for the city to make for a number of reasons, but it's just a very small example of things we were dealing with far before this pandemic. And I think a solution to that, what I feel came out of the pandemic and seeing what, again, citizens made out of the resources they had and the limited space they had access to was just doing it for themselves. And my hope would be that through this experience, there's a kind of vision in play that everyone's able to learn from and see, how can we meaning everyone learn that we can make these public space changes happen in a way that does benefit everyone, and particularly those who need it. So I'll stop there, but I really appreciated the question.
Yes, absolutely. This should be an opportunity for us, and by us, I guess I'm implicating humanity here, everyone, all of us, to rewire and reboot not only how we regulate the use of public space to better allow for activation, but to really address structural issues, historic inequalities, rather than deepen or amplify those. We can be using this time of greater flexibility and permissiveness perhaps to experiment with ways to redress those inequities and to move through equity to equality. And so that's a really abstract statement that can apply to so many different to things. But specifically for public space, I mean, it is a conundrum. I mean, I suppose the metric is as long as everyone's able to be in public space together, and we're not regulating folks out of it, or amplifying the ways that we've already done that, perhaps peeling those back or recasting them. Maybe that is the kind of immediate goal or thought as we figure out how to make it through to the other side. Yes, Jung-in, please.
Yeah, I mean, we already, before the pandemic, expected this kind of disappearance, real physical space, kind of the disappearance of retail stores and all this. So, but the pandemic exacerbated all this condition. It's more deeply. So I mean, sort of we can, see the more deeper change, perhaps, as Robin, you said, the structural change is more deepening that way. But this brings more question than answers, in a sense that I mean, in city like Seoul, now not many people outside. Everything is kind of happening, at their own spaces, and the delivery system, incredible network of the delivery system, is also happening in here. And then people are not that patient, in a sense. You order now, and then next day you can get it, right? All this system is for whose benefit of it? There's a more hiring of these people, but they are more exploited in that sense. The overworking and all this. So this brings a new kind of the condition of pandemic. So which pandemic perhaps led us to see more clearly about these conditions happening.
Yeah, another theme of the conversation we had last night was how the pandemic has, on Tuesday, excuse me, on the program about food systems that Omid and I had curated, was how fragile that infrastructure really is. And the pandemic has really stressed the food systems, to their utmost limit. And, and it's cost human lives. The folks who are working in these industries are more exposed. They're obviously essential. And at the same time, restaurants are at higher risk of sort of closure, not operating. So all of the folks who are employed in that part of the industry are, having a much harder time. And so the fragility of it that this crisis has really brought into high relief underscores, or prompts thinking about how we can make it more resilient, and what we need to do to ensure that the systems can survive shocks like this, and most importantly, that the people who work within these systems to deliver essential goods like food are looked out for and valued and taken care of. So, well, maybe just one more kind of question or prompt from the audience, and then we can bring our conversation to a close. Bev is writing in from the UK, and she says that the films missed the opportunity to share amazing creativity and small acts of kindness over the past year. What are your thoughts on amplifying the joy and spontaneity that's happened? And Vivian talked a little bit about this with the way that folks are using, balconies, and I think there was a little bit of joy in the mobile music box. Folks from New Orleans who were kind of featured throughout the New Orleans film was one small example of how people are just, engaging in acts of kindness and generosity and sharing love and support with one another. But just opening it up to the panel, some closing thoughts on either examples that you've seen or ways we can encourage more of that to happen.
Sure. I had two quick thoughts about that. I think I was talking a little bit earlier about how, everybody needing to stay at home, or for those who can stay at home, is another point to make about that, because that was also, it still is a real concern about who actually is able to work from home. But it's meant that people have not been able to kind of leave their immediate surroundings as much and get to know their neighbors a bit better, help each other out on the street. I mean, I know from my own experience, I've met more people in my neighborhood than I've met in my entire 5 years of living in Brooklyn. I definitely found random acts of kindness to be all around me. I think, something similar to the point about murals mentioned earlier, and using that as like a way to provide some messaging or feeling or emotion about a range of things. New York's kind of known for kind of these subway messages, which I've always really loved. Just kind of an open space for people to leave almost little love notes to the city. And I've seen that all over. So beyond Post-it notes in a subway station, I walk around, and on the ground, I see messages of hope and love all over the place for New York, for the people that live here, to the healthcare workers. And it's been continuing throughout this entire year. So again, I think what inspires me is just seeing people use the city as a place to express themselves and to share positivity with others during this difficult time.
Yes, let's all leave one another love notes in public space. I think that's a fantastic idea. Any closing thoughts from Athens or Seoul?
Well, to me, it's the pandemic condition is essentially the anti-public. I mean, I'm kind of making a bold statement, because it doesn't allow the people to contact, but being in the shared space. But this kind of scarcity is giving us kind of moment of rethink the existing relationship of the people. Whoever that may be, but it gives us a kind of rethinking and how precious, in many cases, how cherished that relationship can be. So this is a kind of more on the other side of this pandemic, which is it somewhat destroyed the public condition, but on the other hand, it kind of preserve and then reinforce that the values.
And maybe if I can share also from the case of Athens, not so much from the European perspective, but what I have seen here, especially for Athens and Greece coming out also from another crisis. We are testing our resiliency for the last decade as a country and as a people. What I have seen again, after also the financial crisis, is what the formal system cannot support. Fortunately, the bottom-up solidarity networks of people can really cover up for the gap that you see in the rest of the system. So, without meaning to make it too political, I think, at least for the Greek context, what this pandemic will also leave behind is a fingerprint out of this kind of sense of caring for each other on the small scale and the bigger scale, and the fact that we will meet all each other again soon, hopefully out in the streets and in the public spaces, and Yeah, and maybe the last thing I have experienced that I really appreciate it, that relates also to the more shopping culture, let's say consumer culture, is that how you can support with small gestures like exchanging a book in the bookstore with someone that you don't know, participating in some similar activity that helped also the bookstore and also to me to feel connected again with someone that I didn't know. Some small love message from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that, I feel like we can end on a note of love. Jung-in, Vivian, Juliet, thank you for joining us from where you are. I can't wait for us to meet out in the street someplace again someday, wherever that might be. So as soon as it's allowed again, or you all can come visit San Francisco. We could take a tour of parklets. Great. So with that, thanking our panelists, Omid and I would like to turn this over to our festival production manager, Christelle Chelek, who'll talk a little bit about what's coming up later this week, in particular this evening and tomorrow, and then we'll bring us to a close.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we had an international audience for this panel discussion. I will be posting the links to the films in our YouTube live video. Some of you have requested that. I'd also like to invite you to join us tonight for exploring the Native Urban Experience in Yelamu in partnership with the American Indian Cultural District. That starts at 5:30 p.m. PST, and you must register. And tomorrow at noon PST, we have Rebuilding Paradise, which looks at the campfire disaster in Paradise and implications for planning around it. Thank you so much for joining. I will drop a link in the chat to please take our survey. It helps us serve our audiences and make sure we know that we are serving a diverse audience. That is gonna be it. Thank you so much for joining and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.